Welcome back to Building Research Relevance. My name is Stephen Shaw. I'm the chair of the Department of Educational and Counseling Psychology at McGill University in Montreal, Quebec. And here we are to talk about how we can improve the relevance of research. Today's talk is going to be about how do we know when research is fully baked and ready to be used in the world. Ideally, you find an outcome that's interesting or useful in some way. And what you do is then you see if you can find it again. Was it just a quirk or did it really happen? Then if that happens, you ask some other folks, hey, can you find this thing? Does it work? Is it real? And see if they find it in an outside lab. Then you can apply it to new context. Then you have something. Now, that's how it works ideally. In education and psychology, we have a different way of doing things. We find an outcome that is barely significant at the 0.05 level, and it may even be p-hack to get it. Then you do a press release, and then you do a TED Talk, and then you write a book, and then you go on a workshop tour that convinces psychologists and teachers to implement your idea. This isn't good. When we do this, yes, it's self-serving and can give you some cachet or some important thing that you really want in life or meet your academic incentives. But in fact, that research is not ready for prime time. It is a questionable finding that may fit into a narrative or tell a story, and that's fantastic. But yet, remember, research relevance means that we have a responsibility. When you have research, it has to be effective because we're going to be applying that, in my area of school psychology, we're going to be applying it on children in schools and in families. It darn well better work. And so this approach just doesn't really work very well. But quietly what happens though is they do their TED Talk, they do their book, they do their workshop tour, they get paid a lot of money to do this. It's fantastic. Everyone's happy. And then very quietly, we find that the finding can't be replicated, if it's replicated at all. But it eventually gets disproved and quickly replaced with something else. But that doesn't get a lot of attention, and the bad idea just continues to live. And especially if the author is charismatic and a really good speaker, they can get like fanboys and fangirls to keep these things going on forever. So we might have something that gets disproved, but it's really important. So this premature adoption of an idea really leads to problems. And we can even call it evidence-based practice because there's one study supporting it. And here's what I mean by that. In schools in the U.S., there's a law called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and requires us to have evidence-based practices. But how it defines evidence-based practices is such that this idea of the barely significant study that accounts for 1% more variance than a previous study means that we change our curriculum. You can call that evidence-based. Because remember, there's 4 levels of evidence-based practices or evidence-based interventions that the ESSA, that's the law, that the law requires. It either has the least strong is no direct support, but it's based on well-defined logic, model, or theory of action. And there are current efforts underway to determine its effectiveness. That's actually considered one of the levels of evidence-based interventions. The next one up is it's supported by one or more well-designed or well-implemented correlational studies with statistical controls for selection bias, or qualitative studies. That's the next highest. The next highest level is one or more well-designed and well-implemented quasi-experimental studies. That's fine, okay. And then finally, it's one or more well-designed and well-implemented randomized controlled trials or experimental studies, which is, I think that sounds good, but randomized controlled trials are really a methodology that's used only for certain types of effectiveness. It's not necessarily a gold standard. Well, nonetheless, even if you do one study, that's great. It's a fantastic study. You find something, and it's one study. Is it ready for prime time? Well, I got to do a little bit of work on this to try to figure out when is something ready for prime time. And it really happened. There was a good paper written by a whole bunch of people who are super smart. Hans Iserman and Neil Lewis and a bunch of folks are on this paper. And what they really did is they were very interested in, can social psychology evidence be very helpful for efforts to address COVID and some of the COVID issues, because people are saying, oh, science can help us with behavior management and public health in such a way that we can improve this. And what they did is they actually looked to an interesting source to find out, when is science ready? And they went to NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. I hope that's right. The space people. And what they have is NASA has something called technology readiness level. Is an idea ready to be implemented and used in practice? Now, we might have issues in our field in reading or therapy or some other form of instruction. And NASA, if it doesn't work, you know it right away because it blows up. And so you got to be ready. It's got to make it work. And so they have these 9 levels that really work really well. And so the first level is you observe a phenomenon or have some basic principles that are reported. The second level is you develop applications of these ideas. The third is that you experiment with critical functions or establish a proof of concept. The fourth is you have validation of various components of the new idea in a laboratory environment. Then you validate those components in a more relevant or real environment. Next you integrate these validated components demonstrated into the relevant environment. So you integrate multiple components of the model. Then you demonstrate the effectiveness of it in an in-flight environment. Then the system is validated in flight qualified in a flight environment. In other words, can it work redundantly? And then finally, do systems prove successful in mission operations? So there's 9 steps there. And what we saw in the Iserman paper, which is from 2020, they determined whether social and behavioral sciences can be helpful for practice. And they used this analogy to the NASA model, which makes a lot of sense to me. And so they defined it as defining the problem with appropriate stakeholders, consulting with consultees to address the relevance of the research problem and possible applications. Systematic literature reviews are next. Select measures of the outcome, including the evaluation, validity, and scaling and measurement. Then compare the possible solutions for positive effects and possible negative unintended effects. Evaluate causal inference and side effects with experimental and replicative studies in a lab environment. Then evaluate those solutions in several studies as close to the target setting as possible. Finally, large-scale application and testing. And finally, if it's successful, they receive feedback and evaluation information to expand and support solutions in theory. This makes total sense. And so what I did with one of my students, Sierra Pexi, we actually wrote a paper that said, what if you took those ideas from NASA and then from social psychology, and what if you applied it to clinical readiness? How do we know when something is clinically ready to go? And so we had ours. You have a description of the problem or phenomenon in clinical case studies or clinic accounts or reports where something's used. In other words, let's say a teacher comes up with a brilliant idea and it works in the classroom and they report the effectiveness of it. Great, that's a good start. That's stage 1. Next stage is theoretical descriptions or explanations of the problem of interest, understanding the cause, the development, the expression, the context, the culture, the environment that creates or maintains the problem. Finally, case studies or examples of interventions that have been used to address the problem might come up. Testimonials, program descriptions, speculations on why some forms of intervention might be most effective. Next, correlational or quasi-experimental support of the effectiveness of interventions to address the study. And this could also include qualitative research too, to improve the understanding of some of the contextual influences on effectiveness. Stage 5 is experimental studies. This can include randomized control studies demonstrating the effectiveness of interventions. And remember, this is the highest level of of evidence-based practice under the law, under the Elementary and Secondary Schools and Education Act. I can't remember what it's called now, but that law. And so what that really means, though, to put it back to the NASA model, the highest level we have is proof of concept, that a study can work in some situation under some conditions. But that's all it means. But there's actually 4 more stages to go before something's truly ready for prime time. There has to be a detailed methodology so that a protocol can be replicated and applied. This requires a lot of open science elements, such as sharing materials, sharing assessment techniques and evaluation techniques, being very clear on who your sample is. In other words, you need to have enough evidence in your methodology, and the methodology has to be detailed enough that things could be not only replicated, but implemented. And this includes things like what are the resources required, such as time, training, materials, cost. All of this has to be put in to the detailed methodology before you can go. And why I say that is you can have a study that's really effective, a brilliant behavior management study. However, what you find out then is it's extraordinarily time-consuming and expensive. And the study only worked in a situation where we had a $200,000 grant and 8 graduate assistants in every classroom and resources to buy all the materials. And yes, it worked. But is that relevant to a classroom teacher? Could it be implemented in a single classroom with no support, with no resources? You need to know this information before you can make the decision. Finally, the next step is there a reproduction of the effectiveness of the intervention with an entirely new sample? We see a lot of studies that work great, wonderful interventions for children with anxiety disorders who are maybe white, middle class from a college town is a convenient sample. But is that going to work with people of a different age, from a different culture, in a different setting, with different implementers, in different environments and contexts? So you really need to expand that out, not just for the sake of diversity, but in fact the sake of validity and robustness of the study needs to be validated before we can truly implement it with good conscience. And that robustness of interventions is also done. What factors and how much implementation variation from the protocol can there be to be effective? This is a real factor in reality. We have these ideas that work in studies, in labs, in controlled setting. Real life isn't controlled. Classrooms are chaotic. Therapy sessions can be really chaotic. All practices require some level of flexibility of implementation to meet the individual needs or the culture or the language or some other aspect, some other critical aspect of the child or the environment in which you're actively working. So there's more, although we've expressed fidelity a lot when it comes to intervention, implementation. Actually, these other questions are just as important. How much flexibility is required for an intervention to still be effective? I love the phrase, it's called fatal mutation. If you change an intervention too much, it just stops working. Well, it would be helpful if we actually had research to know how much can you change it and what can you change before it stops working. This is a very important and incredibly valuable part of research on effectiveness. And then finally, the last stage is interventions have been implemented and evaluated in multiple clinical settings and classrooms, and not controlled or laboratory, but multiple real-life in idea settings. These are hard to do. Right now, there's 9 stages here, as I described, and this is in a paper in Psychology in the Schools from 2021 that describes all of this, including the NASA stuff. But the truth is, we only go through 5 stages at the most of having an experimental study that shows something effective, and then we implement it, often chaotically, often without any structure or coherence. The studies are not designed to actually be implemented and relevant. The studies are designed, as we talked about with the academic incentives, to get them out and researched or get them out and published so people get their widgets, their publication points. But the truth is, multiple different studies, including replications under many different conditions, robustness, detailed evidence too of step by step how is something implemented. Oftentimes journals do not like papers too long, so they reduce methodology when in fact that is the critical factor to know whether something can be implemented. So as this session talked about, we had this evidence readiness level that Eiserman and his colleagues wrote about, which is brilliant for the social psychology work, but there's also a clinical readiness level. This is how you can determine if research that's available right now is actually ready for prime time and ready to implement on children. I think we need to be just as careful when we do research on child interventions in psychology and education as we are in areas like NASA where things can blow up, or as we are in medicine where things can go bad with health effects. Mental health, educational performance is important and requires this level of support of research in order to make it relevant. These are one component of making research a relevant activity that can truly be helpful for counselors, teachers, psychologists, and others. Thanks so much. And the next time we'll talk about a very specific model that we use in our lab to both implement research and to create a research program. So we'll talk about that next time. Thank you very much. Have a great day.